You guys hear what I'm saying? Okay, so I'm going to quickly introduce the company and our guest speaker today. So today we have HENN. HENN is an interdisciplinary team of architects, engineers, and thinkers with over 70 years of experience in a range of different fields. They currently have offices in Berlin, Munich, and Beijing, and have done some really amazing projects that is worth checking out. If you guys haven't already seen their website, we can add a link to it in the chat for you to have a look at later. Today we have Leander Adrian, who'll be leading our talk with us. He joined HENN in 2015 after finishing his education and is currently the senior associate of the company and was previously the design director for Beijing, I believe. His role in the studio is to lead early phase projects such as compositions, commissions, and generally developing key concepts that later define projects across a range of different scales. And he's going to be taking us through the thought process behind some of these projects. And yeah, we'll be passing on over to him right now.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's really an honor to be among such a high pedigree of some of your previous speakers. So we did our best to try and prepare an interesting presentation for you that we've titled Evolving Systems. And that title actually grew from your wish to have something that actually showed the process of how we develop a base idea to then be a final design. And so that's why we're going to expose a little bit some of the secrets of what happens during the design process and how we evolve designs and come up with our finished concepts. As you've mentioned, we're a third generation architecture firm currently led by Martin Henn, my dear friend and colleague. And the office has really done an amazing transformation in the last 70 years, starting with heavy industrial buildings, innovation buildings, and now moving into other new typologies and fields. As you said, we're a very large team. We're around 350 people, 3 studios currently. And that interdisciplinary approach, that collaborative approach, and this very eye-level approach of being open-minded and sharing ideas is all about creating new influences and new ideas that will then further our design and our fields of expertise. Some of the people that we've worked for, you might recognize some of the names, or well, probably you will recognize some of the names. It's mainly in the automotive industry, but it's also the IT tech industry, cultural institutions, real estate development as a new frontier, science and health, and obviously research and education, with over 150 built projects, with currently around 50 also in the pipeline. Our expertises range from the very early inception, from programming, where we almost do a pre-design phase, which is something I'll explain more deeply in a second, to design, but also all the way to the end of construction management and quality management. So it's really a one-stop shop of where we take the brief and we come up with an idea, and at the end, hopefully, if everything goes well, we can put the key in your hand and give you the building. But as you mentioned, my expertise and my main focus of the talk today will be in the early phases. So looking at programming. Programming is an individual element that we've actually developed in the office over the last 30 years, which for us is one of the key elements as to where we create new ideas, new concepts, and new ways of approaching design. And it usually informs and gives us a new direction, hopefully, if the programming is done right, to then also create new ideas and concepts. So, as I might have just mentioned to your colleagues earlier, in 2021, obviously being such a large team, we have around 35 creative heads between the 3 studios. And our focus in the early phase, we've managed to do around 42 projects in 2021. So we had a very busy year. And this programming, or this approach that we have, which is always a very design or a very analytical approach of how to extract data, how to extract knowledge from clients, how to extract the most we can from a brief in order to create a new idea, is a way that we always apply to the majority of our projects. And by using just that unique process, we always create a different result. So we don't have a stylization, we don't have a one-stop, or let's say it's like some of the architects who have the certain stylization. This is something that we actually conscientiously are going against and also are very proud of. From the 41 projects or 42 projects from last year, I've decided to share with you the process of 4 projects. They're 4 very different projects. The first in the top left is a research and development center in Jülich. The second building is a cultural building or a museum for the German language in Mannheim. Then we have a small jewel of a building in Berlin in the bottom left corner, which is an office building. And then lastly, one of my favorites, an alcohol distillery in Austria. And those 4 projects I've chosen because they each had very deep and different processes and also very different aesthetics. And this is kind of the point that I was trying to make, that the evolution of how we come about with the finished result of a project is always different and is always unique to the current topic. And that's also what keeps it so interesting and so fresh. So I think what I always was thinking about of how to structure the talk, I always like try to do it with a couple of questions that kind of pose or maybe suggest what's coming next. So what I was thinking about, how can I describe the start of a project? There was only one image that came to my mind, and that's of a big fluffy cloud. You have all possibility, you have no idea what the project is going to be. You could shape it in any way you want, somehow not reachable, it's not graspable. But somehow you know there's something that is hiding inside, and that is what you need to now chisel out and also then let crystallize. And that process of how you then evolve these systems of design, or what we call now as systems of design, and that final crystallization is hopefully giving you that powerful, though that unique or that perfect building, which is going to either win you the competition, win you the commission, or bring in that project for the later phases to then also have the joy of building and constructing. So what was kind of interesting, what made me think about, okay, what is our process? And what I was thinking is, what is a process that leads to, inverted commas, good design? Good design is obviously very subjective, but from the 4 projects we chose, we hope that you agree that they are good designs, because we were very happy with them in our internal meetings when we had a little voting about the best projects of the year. And how do we move away from this notion of stylization that a lot of big firms do tend to fall into? I'm not going to mention any names, but I think everyone can think of 1 or 2. And in general, when we approach a project, we always have obviously us as a part of the team. And what we like to do is always have a consultant A or consultant B. Usually it's maybe someone for structure and MEP, one person for landscape, and that we kind of create one system or one team, which each field of expertise is balanced out, and that we can always bounce the ball to each other and from each other in order to come up with new ideas. Because this cross-pollination of different views and ideas is always what makes for the more interesting architecture. And usually this is the kind of constellation for the majority of competitions that is enough. So if we now look at these 3 fields, let's say we have MEP, structure, architecture, and landscape, what we kind of have is isolated systems that everyone is responsible for their kind of system, or let's say their element. And what really happens in the development of a project is that you start creating cross connections, that you kind of start formulating these systems into an architecture of networked interlinked systems. And that you then start saying, okay, how is the massing influenced by the urbanism? What is the concept together with the facade? And then also when you start creating cross-pollinations also between surprising connections, that's when you really start to possibly create an innovation. And so what we would maybe try to propose is that the cross-pollination of these different systems that leads to this evolution. That's why this lecture was titled like that, and that those surprising connections really allow for then this new ideas or something surprising, you know, so that you'd never seen it before, and also the aesthetic is something different in itself. And I think if one amplifies this cross connection, obviously you can't connect everything with everything, but this is more of a diagram to explain the concept. But ideally, you then get something very unique and powerful out of it. And so in order to kind of show you this journey, I'm deliberately not just showing you finished images. We're going to do a bit of an unusual architecture talk where we don't just show the perfect renderings, but we're going to lift the bonnet of the car and look inside the engine. It's going to be a bit dirty, so don't judge some of the sketches, but it's about how do you bring across an idea in a meeting? How do you bring together different ideas from different parties? And how do they then always end up in the final design? So I really made an effort to show from start to finish how a project evolves over 3 months. The first one that we'll talk about is the Brainergy Hub. It's a really exciting flagship building for a new renewable energy R&D park happening in Jülich. So this will be the first building in a master plan. And something that we've developed over the last year, also with the digitization due to Corona, is that we use now a software called Miro, which is always a large digital pinwall where we essentially have the project from the beginning in the top left, where you see the brief, you see the kind of the first prerequisites, all the way to the development of the final panels in the bottom right. So it's kind of like a linear mind map where you see each step of the way, and it made it very easy for me just to jump in, take little snippets and put them together for you in order to try and give you a feeling for the narrative, a feeling for the development, and also maybe for the messiness and chaoticness or the chaos of developing these concepts. So as you come into your professional experience, you'll see there's always a brief. In Germany, the briefs are very formal and they're often very long. I think this one was just 50 pages, but we've had briefs of over 100 pages. And you always have to first formulate and isolate what are the key things, what are the key messages from that brief. And the key message was here that this building has to be a new frontier of sustainability. This building in itself, as a location, it's called the Brainergy Hub for a reason, because it is the epicenter of this whole campus. And this whole campus is connected through its infrastructure to be one functioning city block, which is sharing, producing, and exchanging energy with itself. So if building A is running low, building B can send energy over, and vice versa. So it's really the city or the urban block as an organism. And the idea of our building is that it is the epicenter, it is the beating heart, it is the control system, and it is the main element. So it was a real question, okay, how can you first of all push that frontier? What also becomes very quickly apparent is this notion of flexibility. In the brief, we had a very big range of programs. As an R&D building, it needs to be flexible for the most high-tech and interesting offices, but also be able to change. It needs to have the perfect working environments, and also has to have the right gastronomy. It has a cafe, it has a conference center. So you need to have a certain flexibility, and that was one of the main requirements. So sustainability and flexibility, which are kind of not mutually exclusive. And what we often do is we develop sketches, and, we brainstorm together, we'll have a programming session together, and then there will be some key sketches which try to define some of the visual languages. And I think that's something that the programming that we developed over the last 30 years is really emphasizing, that we extrapolate key ideas, which are maybe text-based or even just in someone's head, and that we create visuals to them so that we can easily then transfer them into something that is also universally understandable, but also changeable, hopefully, into a design. So key concepts were that the building has to be the new heart. It has to be a meeting point in the campus. It has to be an interface or a platform between science, society, politics, and innovation. It needs to be a landmark project for not just for the area, but for all of Germany. So a lot of big words and a lot of meaning behind it, but that's always what's interesting. And I think one of the most interesting one was this notion that a building has to have an organized structure, but it has to allow for creative chaos. So the next thing you obviously do is look at the site, and this site was, let's say, a little bit not really much to work with. It's just a field somewhere in Germany, so it was a little bit abstract, as you can see in the Google Earth image. So you really ask yourself, what is the context? And when thinking about sustainability, and also that this building is a flagship for sustainability, what we realized very quickly is that the sun is the main context of the building, and the relationship that this building shares with the sun has to be the driving force between the key design decisions and the things that we develop. Of course, we then also look into the main massing of the building. We start looking at the building of how we can interface it. And so we look at the building as an infrastructure for flexibility and for the uses, for the programs and the functions that the client wants. And as you can see, the first ideas, sorry, but I did tell you that there are going to be some funny images here. These like meta brain images of how the building is a brain in itself and the molecules of the people inside. We had some interesting discussions, let's say, but somehow this notion that the building is almost like a sponge, and that we need to be able to fill it flexibly with program and also change that. The first designs, as you can see, if I just zoom in a little bit here, are basically based on the old massing of the master plan, which was this kind of long rectangular building. But we quickly realized, that really doesn't feel like a hub. It doesn't feel like an epicenter. It doesn't have an omnidirectionality. It has a very clear singular directionality. So one of the big design decisions that we made was to go from breaking the brief, from going from a rectangle to a circle. What we thought was a very big statement. We thought, we're really going to stand out from the crowd now, and we've really had a lot of chutzpah, and we're breaking out. But what you can see in these massing images is that actually the building from the circular form has a powerful omnidirectionality. You clearly know where the center of the campus is. You have an omnidirectionality of access. You have this kind of radiance around it. It interfaces better with the landscape. So for us, that was a very big, brave statement. Unfortunately, when we went to the exhibition, 7 out of 24 designs were either a circle or based on a circle. So obviously there's a German saying, when der Architekt nichts weiß, dann macht einen Kreis, which means the architect, when he doesn't know what to do, he does a circle. So apparently everyone didn't know what to do, or maybe everyone had the similar feeling that this kind of circular presence has this power to be an epicenter. So what separated us from the other circles, and I think that's really the trick of this project and also the development of this project, is that we, in the discussions with the MEP and the structural engineer and with the landscape architect, that we started throwing out ideas that this is an energy conveyor belt, that the buildings around it are silos or gasometers, and that this building is almost controlling the flow and the distribution of energy between this building, between this campus. And that the function of the building is a social point, but the hub is the hub not just for machines, but for the people. So it started getting very philosophical. We had a really great structural engineer who could talk for hours, and it was always very exciting. But in the end, we came up with these kind of very conceptual, rough sketches that start to show networking, they start to show interfacing, and they start to show how the building communicates with nature. The next step was to then really understand, okay, what is the function within this form? The form is great as a symbol, you know, we've achieved the first goal. Okay, how do we make a landmark? But the second is flexibility and sustainability. And working with this notion of the pixel, or how we subdivide the building into a voxel or into a framework of voxels, that actually allowed us to create a highly functional and efficient building within what is before otherwise, let's say, more formal. And of course, we took on the notions of the previous gasometers. And I think this development of these elements, you can start to see how this very clear rationale exists within this very pure, timeless form. And I think the big breakthrough, and this happens, I think, with almost every project, or let's say all the good ones, because sometimes it doesn't happen and you know you're not going to win when you submit it. But let's say on this one, we were very happy because this very basic, elemental, simple sketch for us actually had all of the ingredients that really defined then the architecture of the building. It showed us where the circulation is. It showed us where the exterior circulation, the cores, the structure. It has all of the principles in it that you really started to read the building as a vessel, you know, and I could imagine how I can plug all my different elements into this building and always change it and let the building develop within itself. And that development with the input of the structural engineer, how do we then accommodate for a wood structure? What is the column spacing? All of these elements, so that we start then being able to, within the circle, create a building that is actually modular. So all of the wooden elements that define the main structure are obviously prefabricated elements, can be quickly assembled on site. How does the landscape of the network of the spaces kind of start creating opportunity for interior versus exterior workspaces? Is there islands of functions in the plazas? You know, we start thinking about how do we embed this building in the context? Because as we know, we've just kind of created a UFO and we plonked it there in the middle of the site. What we know is that there's meant to be a lake in the north, and that somehow in the south, there's this kind of nice orchard. And so somehow we need to create a building that is integrating with its context. So, well, that's what I just said. So I'll just go to the next one. So with the landscape architect, and also very intensively together with us, we started developing sketches. You know, is it this notion of the pixel that is flowing out from the building? Is it this notion of a network? Or how do we kind of interface it with this very rigid, let's say, more monotonous, normal context? How do we network that? How do we bind that together? Because this is a hub. So all roads must lead to Rome. So how do all the roads lead to our hub? And obviously the great name Brainergy, which tongue-in-cheek, we always struggled a little bit with. Not sure where the marketing company came up with that one, but obviously it led us to the notion of neurons. Neurons always searching for the shortest path around 120 degrees. If you ever looked at cracking in the desert, that's always also creating the shortest path. So that was a principle that we applied to our landscape concept. How do we minimize the circulation? How do we maximize the connectivity by using these integrated and natural phenomena? Then looking into this notion, okay, we have the network, it's holding everything together, you kind of start feeling it's integrating with the context, but how do we have this duality and enforcing this notion of a hub? So as you see the building in the center, we have this beautiful lake towards the north, and then we have this forest or this clearing pushing in from the south. It's a little bit of a yin-yang move, but I think the idea was to, how does the interlock, or how does the nature also flow underneath or kind of interconnect with the building? And that is what holds the building in its epicenter and also in its position. And I think that's when it really starts to develop. And when you take that then to the final production, you know, so all of these sketches are always just rough, they're always kind of loose. And then we have usually about 1 to 2 weeks at the end of the competition where we go into full production mode and make everything pretty. So this is this part of the presentation. But you can see here how the main concepts that we talked about, this omnidirectional radiance on the top left, that shows that this building is the epicenter. How the epicenter is connected by all the elements, all the roads leading to it. How we create a pedestrian circulation circulation that harkens it together, how different landscape zones are then framed or also created through this path network, and importantly, how do we have this energy and circulation concept that is also connecting it to the rest of the buildings. And that's really what then integrates it and holds and creates this hub. So as we said, we would also look underneath the bonnet of the car. So we're going to go now into the building. And one of the strong ideas of this building was that we actually had this circulation ring on the outside, and underneath we had this voxel landscape. So we had the symbolism and the functionality. But the functionality was something that was really born out of the process. So how does this flexible framework that we've created function as a building? Does it actually function? Hopefully it will. It's now going into the planning stages after winning the competition. It was a 2-round competition, so from 24 down to 8, and then we were very happy to win this competition, and now we've gone into the planning. So what we of course have now inside this functional framework is the main key concepts. You have a north-south axis, you have the main core and the center, but you have also external cores which are creating the main circulation, so the building can be accessed 24 hours. You have the connectivity of the circulation. And then also you have this very powerful aesthetic. I think what was very interesting in this building is that we did not try to develop, let's per se, a design. We essentially allowed the sustainability to become the actual aesthetic of the architecture. So nothing was wasteful. It was always just to serve a function, and that really was what allowed the building to sing. Here you can see the exterior circulation that connects to these kind of verandas that give access to the different units. Here's this main axis from the north-south. Here's a scene from the lake in the north with this kind of central element in the staircase. Going inside the building, we obviously have these office modules. Each one has its own little private courtyard. The connection with workspaces with the green was very important to the client. We have a clear circulation system of a central atrium that allows for the connectivity to each of these office modules. And obviously we have an individual core. So this very simple framework that we created allowed us to bring in this complexity, this functionality. It allowed us to tick all of these boxes, which were always given in the brief that one has to analyze out and then also kind of facilitate into it. So it kind of just flowed. Sometimes a project flows and sometimes it doesn't. And this one luckily managed to flow quite well. Here's an interior view. So you see the strong connectivity with green. We actually applied green planters as the room dividers. You have on the left one of the green courtyards bringing natural light into the office spaces, natural ventilation. On the right, you would see one of the verandas with the views out into the landscape. So you have minimal office steps that allow for permeation and a lot of natural daylighting. And lastly, we have the photovoltaic, and that was kind of the cherry on the top for us. That was a great idea from our our MEP engineer, Paul Carew from Huppold, where we not only have a publicly accessible student roof garden with the functions that allow for kind of hanging out in the not for students, for the startup R&D people. You guys are the students, and that allows for a maximum increase of photovoltaic on the roof. But one last really great idea was to say, okay, we have this ring, and it's a circle that is obviously very much connected to the sun path. Why don't we, rather than just wrapping the facade in a static photovoltaic, why don't we allow the photovoltaic on the veranda to follow the path of the sun? So it's a dynamic facade. So the building changes with its main context, which I said before was the sun. And that allowed for this kind of very unique image, which the mayor of Jülich really loved, because this idea that the building is obviously dynamic, and it's almost like a large sundial. You can read what time it was depending on how it's reacting to the environment around it. So, second project, and how am I doing for time? Okay, I'll try and speed up a little bit. Forum Deutsche.
No, it's okay. Take your time.
Okay, I'm doing my best. Maybe I'll drink a little water. Forum Deutsche Sprache is actually a project which I was not so much involved in. It was developed by my very good colleague and co-head of the studio, Armin Namati, with his team. But I have the privilege of being able to show it to you guys. It's one of the firm favorites of the office this year. And it was very, very much based on a very simple message, simplicity, again, as a key concept. And on the left, komm, sprich mit mir, it means just come and speak with me. And that was the main intention and message of building. And how do you then create an architecture which allows for that? And I think that was the real challenge. And also looking at the development of the building in the mirror board, that was really interesting. And inside this vessel, there was kind of three main elements. You have research, you have exhibition, and then you have the forum. And that's it. But within those very simple elements, that within that simplicity, you have a high degree of complexity, because usually when you add people to things, people create complexity in themselves. And that kind of dynamic, that kind of life, the different functionalities, they all come together and they create a very vibrant and elegant building, which is for a building that is focused on language, obviously that has humans as the main factor. So it's kind of formulated from two elements. It's like a house within a house. So you have this very beautiful crystalline envelope, and then inside you have a very simple but very pure and very spatially interesting series of platforms or layers that then formulate and create this very kind of deep and also interesting building. But if we go into the process of how that building was created, or how do you design a building to invite people to communicate, I think it's really interesting to look at the boards, actually, because I wasn't so involved in this project. So that's why I really enjoyed looking through it. And I think there was one of the interesting things that one sees is like, there's very abstract notions of how does one create a building that is looking at language, So they're looking at a structure of symbols, or what is the structure of sound? What is the structure of emotion? What is the structure of data? I mean, there's so many forms of language, and how do they all get filtered? They get filtered by this big mass that each of us has, some maybe more than others. And that is the center of linguistic activities, and how that language of the visual is something that we try to extrapolate, which is very meta, but it also really helps the discussion. So one of the first studies was this very beautiful, I have to say I was very struck by this image, a very beautiful, expressive, vibrant form living inside a very, very pure and calm element. But if you now think about it, and also think about the discussions that were had, if the building is about language, how can then the building be distracting from the language in itself? So I think that was one of the key factors as to why this design, maybe, even though it's very evocative and exciting, maybe kind of died out. Then there was another reaction, the more conservative form. It should be more clear, more solid. How do we then have an empty shell that that people can come into? Is it something more rhythmic that is kind of echoing this notion of sound? So lots of interesting formal approaches, but somehow because they are so formal, they also lack then this notion of what really transcends it. And you can see the building got more and more simplified. Then it went into these arches, creating very interesting three-dimensional arc spaces. But somehow the discussion changed. And the idea of the project was, no, you can't now design a language museum, because the language is the display. And if you distract from language, then I think you're missing the point. And I think this notion that the museum it cannot be a museum. A museum is something that is dead. You look at the antiquities, all the mummies, and you go look, and you're not really part of it, and you leave again. So the building should transform into a platform. And I think these studies, they really start to evoke this notion that the building is a function, it's vibrant, it's alive. But actually then the real interesting element, I think that made this building and this project successful, and also won the competition ultimately, was to say that this building is not a platform, but it is a forum, because it has activity. It is a live place where people come together, and it's all about the people to come and exchange the live language, because without people, there is no language. And that then kind of developed into then a very pure and elemental architecture that doesn't scream from the outside, but it invites you in. That was the main message. But in its very simple geometry on the interior, it creates three-dimensional and connected spaces that still allow you to shout from one person to another, from a low level to a high level. And I think that is where it really starts to become something much more sophisticated. So you're not just trying to design the shit out of it, excuse my French, but you're letting the actual happenings of the space define it. And I think these sketches really start to also show a lot of the thinking that was happening. You start thinking about how are people moving in this space. So we made a space that is great for communication, but how do we let people walk around in it? And I think that notion of experience, and that was a really beautiful element of this project, is that the whole structure is held by these four elements. This main element here, and 2 and 3 and 4, and the rest is cantilevering. So it's a column-free space, and that kind of column-free space allows for a curated space, but it also allows for serendipity. I think the drawings here really illustrate that in a lovely way, how there's a dynamic movement of the people. You never know how someone walks through a space. Everyone has a unique understanding of space and a unique approach. Oops, apologies, flagging a little bit. Unique understanding of the space. And within those four, let's say, stakes, you can create very different worlds. You have an atrium, you have a box, you have the circle, very elemental, but very evocative and very powerful. And those layers together, if you now explode them, you see how it creates very different worlds. And those worlds are all held together by this lovely envelope, which was developed together also with our MEP engineer. So the whole sustainability behind it, the air cavity, how the airflows work, it's all creating one system. And that's, again, this emphasis on the interlinking between different expertise that interlink in their different systems. And that's what creates a holistic and really evocative final result. And I think then here, just the last couple of images of this project, you see how this purity kind of is described not only in the visuals, but also then in the final elevation, which for me always kind of summed up the project in a really elegant and successful way. All right, 3/4 of the way there, or let's say halfway there. The next project is Nollendorfplatz, a really lovely little project in our hometown, Berlin. Nollendorfplatz, obviously being one of the centers in Berlin, quite famous. And that was a competition we won this year also, which is now also in planning. And it has a really unique location. You know, it's really at one of the knots of the city, you could call it. There's a lot of main axes arriving here. And it actually has, which is very unusual in Germany, obviously, or let's say in Berlin, it has an extremely powerful context building. So this building is the Metropole Theater. It's a building built, I think it was in the early 1910s. It survived the war, and that is our neighbor. So it's a really large, imposing, powerful, beautiful building of a little symbol of what Berlin used to look like. And here you can see an image or a postcard of Nollendorfplatz before the war. So it was a green, beautiful plaza surrounded by beautiful buildings, with then the new high-tech elevated tramway, U-Bahn floating above it. This is Nollendorfplatz now. So obviously, as you know, the war happened, and many of you have been to Berlin. Unfortunately, there's a lot of, let's say, not so beautiful buildings that were erected very quickly because of housing shortages and the need for space. So the city obviously was a really big player in this, and especially with having such an important and beautiful context of the Metropole Theater here, the question of what we erected on the site meant that we had a competition which had, I think, 3 or 4 rounds, which is really unheard of. Sometimes you have competition with 2 rounds, but 3 rounds or 4 rounds, it was, let's say, we're very testing for the team, and one had to really approach it with a good spirit to get through it. But we managed to break through in the end. And interestingly enough, with this project, the massing, or let's say the ground massing that we used for the design, we found within almost the first week or 2. We had basically kind of an envelope that we had to exist inside. It was this T-shape. So we did a variety of experimentations of how can we make this T-shape interesting to bring in some context. And we very quickly settled on the second one, which we call now fillets. And actually the reason that we settled on it is because we anyway need to close the city block, you know. But what we have is this really amazing context, as I mentioned before, which has in its foundation, in its language, in its base vocabulary, this notion of softness. It has round elements. Also, the interior space of that building has a similar quality. So we basically take on this notion of how do we mediate with the context, and we allow this element to basically fold, and the building essentially interfaces with the context, but also folds in different directions. And that created a very simple but powerful partner to this very important building with then this very kind of heterogeneous normal context. And that as a massing had 2 very simple moves. You had, first of all, a little guy at the base, which created the main entrance. And at the top, which was really seen happily by the city because we respected this tower, we created a city view terrace, which kind of let the building take a step back, created a beautiful terrace view, and it allowed that tower to kind of have prominence and not be buried by this new build. So it's about showing respect, you know, because Berlin, unfortunately, doesn't have all the architectural heritage that it used to have. And that's what we really work towards. So as you see, we were very happy. We had 2 weeks into the competition. We had a really sick massing. We were like, yeah, this is no problem, easy peasy, let's go. So we're like, okay, time for facade. And this is always what happens. When one thing is too easy, then the other thing will come and catch you. So again, we did the usual story. Okay, let's analyze the context, and there's obviously this theme of arches is something very visible in the Metropole. So like, there's so many cool examples of arches and things. Let's try facades with that. But somehow it just looked super weird. Like it was always too much. It was kind of too small. It was like transition, and then it looked like too Venetian. Somehow it felt decorative. There wasn't that elegance, there wasn't that sophistication. It's, you know, it's just applied. And that's kind of what I mean. Again, if you try to do one thing and then you just chuck something against it rather than inter-evolving the systems, then you get this effect. It feels like it's applied, you know, and that's what you don't want. You want to have something that is, one cannot live without the other. So we did what happens often in competitions. Once there's a kind of a weird bug, then you start going into iterations and you start losing your mind, and you're going through all these things. And in the end, this is even all of the iterations that we did. You kind of have to say, okay, stop. What are we doing? What is going wrong? And how can we reassess the situation? And this is where I, again, would emphasize on this kind of programming approach, this readjusting, this re-looking at what do we have to work with? How can we extrapolate from the things that we have? What do we know? And what we did is we just took a step back and we said, okay, what is the metropole? Yeah, the metropole is defined by three main moves, let's say. It has a very clear horizontality, and it of course has these large fillets which are kind of creating a geometry, but it also has a very powerful verticality in the sense of these very strong elements which are almost creating a frame, and then these very finely spaced vertical elements. So it has this kind of dynamic between two worlds. And then lastly, of course, it has this roundness in the form of the arcs. Yeah? And actually what we then did is we applied these, but in very abstract and simple ways, and also showed that to the client and to the city of how we analyzed and understood the context, but then reapplied it and interpreted it. And that ended up in a very timeless and elegant facade, which is defined again by these three main moves. You have a clear horizontality, which is seen here in the first image. You have these moves, this fillet as a negative space, which is here reciprocated by a positive on the context building. You have that again on the base for the entrance. You have on the vertical, these very powerful vertical elements which create a frame. We have that on the left and the right of our building. We have a beginning and an end. And within that, we then have this very delicate vertical copper elements, which are taking on this verticality, which everyone was actually surprised in the jury because no one really read the verticals until you highlighted it. And lastly, which was really I think what really sold the project, we have this very unique characteristic, massive 3 by around 5 meter curved glass, single piece glass facade, which is probably the Apple store will be calling soon if we manage to get this built, because that's quite pushing the envelope of what you can do, first of all, with format of glass, but then also trying to curve the glass. But by curving the glass, you create a very subtle echo of the notion of the decorative arch. And that is what really created a holistic and a holistic language between the buildings that allowed them to speak to each other and to have a subtle conversation with each other. And I think that's really what you have to do when you're dealing with such important historical context and with such a sensitive subject. Materiality is then something that was super important for us. And we first started off with concrete, you know, it was super dead, it was horrible, like the city was freaking out. They were like, yeah, it's just not nice, there's so much concrete there already. And then switching to a material, it's like Muschelkalk, which is a form of limestone, locally sourced. So for sustainability reasons from Brandenburg, first of all, really reduces the carbon footprint of the building, has this great haptic. You can make it rough, you can make it smooth, you can really work with different elements. We looked at wooden window frames with then copper detailing in order to give a small, delicate, but also using recycled copper in the building. And we combined that with a holistic vision for the sustainability of the building. This was something else very important to for the city, was that actually that our building is a net zero building, which in the first round, I have to be honest, we kind of fluffed, but in the second and third round, we kept developing, we kept kind of coming up with the concepts. So we have prefabricated, minimized floor slabs, which are built off-site for quick assembly times, minimal waste of resources. You have the prefabricated columns, which are cross-laminated timber. You have the wooden frames. You have the natural stone cladding. And then obviously, as a last element, the recycled copper elements, which are creating the main facade elements. And all of these, the elements, all these, again, I'm gonna hammer this home, all of these systems together, they create a holistic impression of the interior space. So here you see a sketch of what the feeling, the ambiance is, but everything has to hold together. It's all one language, one element, and one kind of orchestra. On the exterior of the building, you then see how these elements come through. You have the rough haptic, which gives kind of a human or kind of timeless feel to this kind of beautiful facade. It's contrasted by these slick, curved glass elements, which flush go into the copper elements, again, taking on this notion of the curve and the floor plan of the metropole, applying it on different scales, making entrances from it, making a facade detail from it, and then making the window from it. So always interrelating all these elements that kind of sing together to hold the building together. From the front of the building, then you see how this building is very calm. It sits inside. You have the conversation with the building on the right, but it also has like a little wink in its eye with the way that the glass, the curved glass, has a special reflection of the sky, and you have this roughness that is contrasting it. But actually, like as a last element that I think was really pleasant on this building was actually when the building transforms from day to night, was actually that one of the last elements that was, I think, also one of the funniest moments of the final presentation was to say, you know, we really took on this notion of what we learned from the building as a context, and there was these beautiful sculptures on the buildings next to us, these reliefs, which show all kinds of different Greek poetry or and things like that. But what we realized is that when the building transforms from day to night, that the people, the occupants, and the life inside the building then themselves are still lives, just like what is happening on the metropole, but they're dynamic, they're alive. So again, this notion of conversation and this way that you interact the different systems, which was a really nice cherry on the top on this project. It was a lot of fun, I have to say, this guy, even though it was quite stressful. All right, so I'm doing my best. All right, I'm not doing too bad on time. Last project, last but not least, as I said, probably one of the favorites of the studio, not just because they sent us 30 bottles of schnapps to taste, but also because the design is obviously quite interesting. It's for a company called Prince, as I said, a schnapps distillery. Schnapps is like a German liquor, which you drink after food or after skiing, for example. And we were tasked, and this is probably the most I would say traditional form of programming that I'm going to show. So all of these projects have a form of programming or the methodology of programming within it. But this one is actually like from A to Z, the classic, what you want. You have a proper team. You go on a site visit. You go down there. We went to Austria for 3 days. Obviously, we had to research all of the fine liquors. We got to tour the production facilities of the current production facilities, the storage network, the Stammhaus, which is kind of their birthplace. Also the different properties around, and that is always what we do, or what we try to do, is we always try to have this very strong connection. And this being a commission, the other 3 were all competitions. This being a commission means you have a really great connection with the client, and you can extract and you can learn all of these processes, and you become an expert in distilling schnapps in 3 days. Well, that's what should happen. And what we do is this externalization of all the things that we learn. So on this case, we had a really great colleague of mine, Chiara, coming from the programming team, and was together with another colleague of mine called Klaus. We went there and we just toured around. And as you can see with all these drawings, every kind of important piece of information is visually externalized and captured on these very small A5 cards. And we collect them. And in the end, it becomes a sea of information, but everything has a very clear message. And then you can actually start to structure these messages into very different and kind of important fields, you know, which one is based on the construction, what's general, what's about the oh God, Obsthof, the fruit arrival place, sorry, switching gears sometimes not so easy. What's about the production, you know, what is coming out of it. And in the end, we have these dualities. We have interviews with the family, we have interviews with the marketing chief, we have interviews with the production chief, in order to extract what is their wishes, what is their problems, what do they want from the new building, what do they have, what do they need to solve. And from that, we then have very clear messages that we can basically say, okay, that is what we need to do, and that's how we solve it for the client. So it's really a dream when you have this opportunity to do this. So this was for an example for the interview for the family. So they were interested in it needs to attract people, you know, so it has to have a little bit of a landmark quality. It has to have, it needs to show the production process in the architecture, you know, that's the really important thing. It has to start with the B and it ends with the glass. And lastly, you know, it has to have this Urlaubsbilder vermitteln. So you need to really feel like you're on holiday when you're at the building, which that's kind of a tricky one to do. Oh, thank you. Cleaner is switching on some more lights. But what actually came out from all of these interviews and all of these things that we did was that we establish dualities, because this is a company that is super high tech, but it's also hardcore and traditional. It's like 100 years old, but at the same time, they want to use robots to do the bottling, So there's this really interesting duality that was happening. So you have man and machine, you have high tech versus low tech, you have modernity versus tradition, which I think in the architecture really was an important role. Then you have production and experience. You have, first of all, you need to be efficient. It needs to run like it's production. I don't want to lose money, but also you need to make an experience for the visitor. So the visitor comes and wants to buy the liquor. And then you also need a connection between architecture and nature. And you want young people and old people to have fun there. So it's like a whole family day out and experience, and that this connectivity between what is interior and exterior isn't lost. So there's a lot of dualities, and that wasn't easy to find a solution for. So the first thing that you sometimes need to do is you first need to understand the process. And only when you fully understand the process, and here's the production process, and I think the really charming thing, what they also said in the beginning, so the first step of every bottle that they sell is the bee. It's one bee that goes and pollinates a plant. And then you create the fruit. From that, you press the fruit, then you ferment the fruit, then you burn the fruit, then you let it ferment again, but in a barrel. Then you go into the bottling, until you get the end, you get the final glass of wine, not glass of wine, the glass of spirit. But actually what you really want to do, and this is when it starts to become interesting for the architectures, you don't just want to do a linear process. Also in production architecture, you need to find ways to innovate the production process. And that's really what you then create also interesting spatial paradigms that you then have to deal with yourself. So I think here we started to create a cycle. We had the notion of a network process. So how can different processes start informing each other? How does the composting or the usually thrown away elements come back into be the composting for the fruit? So you start creating an interconnected process, and that is when really what starts to get interesting. And then you start placing that process on the site. And of course, that process needs to be efficient, but it needs to be connected with the different senses. And I think this was a really great diagram where we had the production system, but then we had the people who have to experience the production but not get involved in it. But they want to have the experience in different ways, because you have 5 senses, and obviously food and drinking and tasting are very interesting senses, but you can use all 5. You can touch the fruit, you can taste the raw fruit, you can hear the production process, you can smell the burning, you can see the fields of the fruits. So there's many different ways to experience this production process, and that's really what we try to emphasize in the architecture. So now just to get to the nitty-gritty, and we're getting towards the end, I promise. We have then the site, and we have this pre-existing site condition of the current production processes with the big fermentation tanks and things like that. And here you have these testing fields, and they were so advanced, they had robots which were automized to pick the fruit from these rows of trees. So they're already experimenting with the next level of farming, and they basically are experimenting with that in order to give it to their providers, their service providers, and then the service providers are able to provide more fruit for distilling. So there's a real interesting R&D innovation system going on in the hills of Austria, very surprising to us, because we always thought it was a very traditional kind of little bit of an old school industry. And what we usually do with this kind of project is we did the programming, so we did this research, we come up with all this cool stuff, and we have a deep understanding now, and then we start really getting the nitty-gritty of doing the designs. And I didn't go into too much detail of these, but we basically have a midterm presentation with the client where we show 3 very different approaches to production, 3 very different approaches to the design and the form of the building, and also 3 very different approaches to how the building is built and constructed. The first one was taking the notion of the fields. You have landscape, you have nature, and you say, why don't we take the surrounding area as a site map, and we actually create the notion that the building is a 3-dimensional topography of fields, and that you have then on these fields the different fruits that are being grown for the production process, and underneath these fields you have the production facilities. So the building is a piece of landscape, and there's always kind of, you don't know where it starts, where it ends. The second one, it was based on this notion of these beautiful rolling mountains, which are obviously there in the Alps. But we also have the traditional architecture of these little pitched roofs, which you always see everywhere when you're driving through there. So the idea was to kind of create one gable mountain that is kind of creating half landscape, half building. And I think then the last one, which is also the one that I'm going to go into deeper because it was the chosen one, was taking the notion of a module and how it can create a building from a very simple base element, and that then creates a very new and different understanding of what architecture can be, or what production architecture can be. So, as I said, one of my favorite elements was always this notion of the bee. And what we found super important was to give habitat to the bee, because as they said, the bee is the smallest employee of the company. So our aim was to really create a beautiful habitat to keep lots of our employees around. And not only did we create that habitat, but we also looked and learned what can we learn from a bee. So a beehive, obviously, as everyone knows, is very modular. It's based on this hexagonal form, but it's something that is reciprocated. And then through the multiplicity of it, it creates the hive and it creates the new epicenter where all of the bees or the workers can come together and work. So we really liked this idea, and we really liked the idea of creation of habitat, and we didn't like the idea of separation of building and landscape. So you don't just want to plonk a production hall on the ground. You want to have a unification of building and landscape, so you don't really know where's the beginning, where's the end. You let people be able to walk on the roof, and you don't pollute or give a visual pollution to this beautiful natural landscape that is existing in the area. So this notion was really developed, and we thought, okay, how can we combine this? And as we have a lot of experience with production and industrial architecture, something that really defines industrial architecture is the notion of a module. So you start with the ground module, it has a certain column grid, and you copy paste that around, and then you have a lovely production hall that's flexible and blah, blah, blah. But that's kind of boring, and it doesn't exhibit and bring to us the kind of architectural qualities that we want. So we introduced the notion of shifts in order to bring light into the building, so the workers inside the building have natural daylight. And then we combined it with the two other important elements to us: the connection of habitat for the bees, so making green roofs, and also the notion of terraces, so that people on their experience of the production can step outside and see the beautiful vista around it. And by taking this module and multiplying it, what you actually create is a modular topography. So the building in itself is a landscape, but it is a functional building underneath. So it's blurring the boundaries between architecture and nature, which was also one of the premises of the dualities that we'd established with the client. So we experimented around, and then we started, okay, what happens if we do a full wood structure? How far can we push it? And luckily, we have a really great partner who's also an Austrian local, Merz Clown partner, who helped us develop a structural system where we could create a wooden modular construction system where one module with the multiplicity of it creates the growth. And from that developed also the maximum spans. Everything was on a grid. It's all prefabricated. It's all assembled on site. So really creating the most efficient and the most fast to build construction system that we can, and also with the requirements that we had for the different spacing, for the different vats, because there's massive vat, and you'll see in a second. So here's one vision of what that could look like. So you see the building now, this is the vision 2030, phase 2. So when the building would be complete, because the building actually needed to be able to grow. So we have phase 1 and this is phase 2. So the module allows for the client to grow. And as their production ramps up, and this is what they're aiming for, they are able to expand the building as they need. And as it expands, the design actually gets better, I would say. But you can see this modular topography. You can see people being able to walk on these terraces. You have then these growing fields which create the habitat for the bees. You have then the experimentation fields here in the south, which are able to run up onto the building. So this blurring, this merging, this interconnection of these different usually separate systems of, architecture stands on the green field or on the landscape goes around. Here, you don't really know where it is or why, or you know why it is, but where it is. And I think this view also kind of sums up how the building is actually very modest. And this was also important for the client because their values as a business was not to be opulent, not to be shouty, not to be crazy, but it was to reflect the qualities of being subtle, being elegant. And because the building interfaces and blends with nature and just has these rare moments of where it pops its head out and creates this kind of little bit of a tongue-in-cheek echo of the gable roof structure, it interfaces with the landscape because first of all, it matches the rolling hills in the background, but it also takes the vernacular of the traditional architecture of the area. So this would be a view of phase 1. Phase 1 being hopefully built by 2025. Unfortunately, this project, they really want to build it, but because of Corona, all of the ski huts were closed, and that's where they make a lot of their money. So hopefully once people start drinking and skiing again, although I wouldn't recommend the two of those together, they will be able to start the project again. But phase 1 really shows a very highly functional, but also a little bit of a good introduction to this new paradigm, which is what the company was looking for. Underneath, I'm just going to quickly go through the production processes. So you have, of course, a back of house area, which is the production area. So you have the main delivery. So this yellow area was all of the production processes. And you have a front of house connected to the old traditional building, which is kind of the main arrival center for the visitors, with this kind of area here, which has a shop, a restaurant, terraces, and things like that. The circulation, of course, is very important. I mean, they have these massive trucks bringing tons and tons of fruit in, but so you don't want to expose the visitors to that. So we have the road that allows for a kind of a little shortcut to the back here, where you have a loading dock where they weigh the fruit. You have then the docking elements, which allows for the unloading of the fruit, and then the production process can begin. And so actually what was really great on the design is that the unloading and then the loading can be unified. So the same truck can deliver fruit and then can take the finished bottle with it. So where do you start and finish a production process? If I remember, I showed you before this linear process, we created that circle, and that allowed us to minimize the circulation. But importantly, and this was also one of the key factors for them, was the experience of the visitor, because, you know, this is their clients. The clients want to see how things are made. They want to be part of it. So what we did is we created essentially a floating mezzanine level, which starts and ends your tour in the visitor center. So you exit through the gift shop. Probably you guys have heard that one before. This one really encourages that. So sorry about that, but capitalism sometimes kicks in. But we have the experience of the Hofladen, the shop being the beginning. And actually what this veranda allows you to do is follow the step-by-step linear process of the production from the fruit to the finished product, step by step. So you see each development and you can actually see what is happening. So you're not just seeing the fruit, then the finished bottle, then you see the press. You're seeing this life cycle, and you really understand and you learn how this very passionate product is created by a very passionate family that is running this business with really interesting people that are also functioning it. So this coexistence of allowing maximum flexibility and efficiency on the ground floor. You want to minimize for production any kind of vertical movement, and then on the +1 level, the tourists kind of sipping their schnapps and looking down and not really seeing what's going on. And lastly, then, these little experience pockets where people can step outside, they can enjoy the view, this notion of inside outside. If you remember, that was one of the dualities. So that was something that was really coming out great in this modular topography. Then some models that kind of represent that. And I think I would be very happy if we managed to get to the Vision 2030. Of course, 20 for 25 would be a great start, but I think in 2030, it really changes from a building to something that is not a building and it is not a landscape. So that's hopefully what will happen in the future. And I think that as a last image, what's the time? Okay, not bad. I actually managed to keep pretty good on time for once. Usually I go over. A last image where I think that summarizes the project: the rolling hills, the natural topography, the subtleness, the power, and also this kind of ability for people to expand. So as a finishing note, I hope I managed to make clear this earlier thesis of how we evolve systems, how we evolve the different systems of architecture in order to create the different buildings. And if you're interested in helping us to develop some of these systems, you can send me a portfolio. We're always looking for young, fresh talent. And now I would hand over to my lovely hosts for any questions. Hopefully there are some. Thank you very much for giving me your time.
Thank you. That was a really fast-paced, really informative session. I think the thought process you took us through of each project was really, really informative. And yeah, we're going to ask some questions now. Like, you guys can put in the chat or turn your mic on and ask. To start us off, I wanted to ask a question. So out of all the projects that you presented, which one would you say is your personal favorite?
I mean, I don't have children, but it's kind of like having children in this. You have to choose your favorite. I personally love all of them for different reasons. I think the Museum Deutsche Sprache from the team is really great. The Prince one, I personally think I haven't seen something like that before. That's why I would find that probably one of my favorites. Yeah, probably.
Okay, thank you.
Not because I'm an alcoholic or anything, but maybe small.
Yeah,
I just wanted to say one thing, that, you know, we usually wrap up the general presentation on our Instagram and things like this, and we are sending each other's photos or whatever. And we sent almost each slide because each of them was really beautiful. And I want to highlight it, that the quality of the drawings, the renders was
thank you.
sophisticated. So
yeah, I would love to say, I have to say one thing. This is a big team and a really great creative team. So I always have to give a big shout out to the whole members of the studio, the renderers, the model builders, the designers, the planners. They always come together and make really interesting, powerful things. So that's where all that quality comes from. It comes from our team of people. So go guys.
so thank you to our whole team.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? You also have some comments in the chat, if you can see them, saying that it was an amazing project and facade and very impressive projects and designs. So there you go.
No
I guess one question regarding kind of the facades and how you achieve this crystal look of the glass.
The crystal look of the glass.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a question for our main renderer, Andre. I'd have to ask him. He's a very experienced renderer, so I can't give you details on that. But yeah.
But is it the more or less the approach that you want to also achieve in real life?
I mean, I think when you're then going on later to construct a building, you really need to do live field tests. So, you know, you can choose different layers of film or what kind of treatment the glass has in order to have the different colorations. And I think that's something that one can try to simulate in the rendering. But actually, what we have is we have an in-house facade specialist who gets the different types of glass in, and then we will go outside and hold the glass against the sun and look at it from a distance, and only then seeing it real can you actually see it. These are visions of what we hope it will be, and usually we get it pretty good to being similar, but that's always a little bit of the quality of early phase, is that you can sell dreams, you know, and I think that's also what competitions is about, and that's how you capture a jury, that's how you capture the audience, and you convince a client to let you build your crazy ideas.
I understand that fully. No, we just wanted to hear more, you know. Trust me, we love to sit here a little bit longer just to listen about it. Maybe part 2.
Yeah, so we can do another one. That's no problem.
Yep.
Okay.
Let me know. We have other projects. I mean, there's another project which I'm not allowed to talk about yet. Maybe that would be a great one for later, which would be.
Pardon?
Sorry?
She disappeared.
Oh, okay. But we have a question in the chat. The question was saying, you mentioned that creating environments for bees was important for you as they are the smallest workers in this scenario. How do you achieve that? Did you provide some solutions for them? That's the question.
So I didn't include the slide, but essentially the structure of the roofs, if I go into the roof image quickly. So what we have is we have essentially 3 different roof typologies. We have we have like a solid earth element, which means that you have enough humus. You know, humus is always the earth where the roots can grow. So we have one element which is just pure earth. So that means I can actually plant a fruit tree there, and that's where obviously if when a fruit tree grows, that's where a bee loves to go and pollinates. Then we have the green roof, which has enough of a structure underneath, but also enough depth of earth. So the structure needs to be strong enough to hold, I think it was at least 30 or 50 centimeters of earth. That's enough earth for flowers to grow. And then we have a normal grass green roof, which is a very thin layer, which is just kind of like a green grass roof. So that's thin. And we essentially apply different layers. So the lower, as you can see here, the lower the roof element, the deeper the soil element, which means for the larger the type of plant. And by creating that layering, we essentially created the 3 different environments that are needed. So first of all, you have the fruit trees where the bees like to go and they pollinate, you know, because they get the nectar. Then you, they pollinate the flowers. Then you have the meadows, which are full of flowers where the bees can pick up their nutrients. And then you have a grass layer as a last layer. So that was kind of how we created a strata of these different environments, which is basically what happens in any mountain. You know, you also have different stratas of environments as the topography of a mountain changes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, we care a lot about the bees in this one.
Any more questions? Or... Okay, we have one more question. Oh. Oh, never mind. They said that it was very comprehensive and that all the questions were answered. as the developments, and then you just go
I think
in,
that needs to be said as well. That's very comprehensive, everything. Right?
Yeah, it was really, really thorough. We were all talking about it behind the scene of the call as well. Like, I think you explained each aspect of the project really, really well, and I think that's why there isn't that many questions from people today.
Cool.
And yeah,
that's fine. I mean, I'm very happy to present it to you. It was great, and I hope that we'll be able to present some other projects at another time. If there's no more questions, then we can also go home. It's 7 o'clock here in Berlin, so it's home time for me. But I would just say a big thank you, and thank you for the lovely compliments, and I hope to see you guys soon then.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. And for the first time, well done.
Well done. That's good. That's big praise. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was
All right, guys.
a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy your evening. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.